A century ago, Britain ruled over a quarter of the planet. In this series, I will go in search of Britain's imperial past.
I have found gold.
And uncover its legacies. How did a small island on the edge of Europe end up dominating the world?
He turned a miserable group of accountants into swashbuckling pirates.
From its proudest achievements to its most shameful failures.
We're ripped away from Mother Africa into a strange land.
And how has the history of empire transformed Britain?
We became the black people of Britain.
On this journey, I uncover the extraordinary story of the biggest empire that the world has ever seen. In this program, I'm going to explore how the lure of Africa's wealth drew the empire into a shameful war. Here, surviving more than 100 years, original barbed wire, and a century of racial oppression. Followed by the rise of Africa's most famous revolutionary. I met Mandela once when he was here in London visiting as President of South Africa. Sat with Her Majesty the Queen, two heads of state lunching together on level terms. And I thought, what an achievement by a man who was imprisoned for much of his adult life, having fought for equal rights for black South Africans. How did the immoral system of apartheid emerge from the colonization of Africa?
The idea of subordinating black people and making them into a vassal class does not start after 1948.
And what part did the British Empire play in its creation? I was a child when I first heard stories of the Zulu Wars. Heroic young British soldiers in red tunics and pith helmets, battling an overwhelming onslaught of fierce African warriors, waging war against the British Empire. Africa was the last great frontier for Europe's empire builders. A dark continent, forbidding and dangerous, that nonetheless promised enormous riches to those who dared to penetrate its vast, uncharted wilderness. The cliché that I grew up with hides a far more complex story. The scramble for control over Africa would face the British Empire with its biggest challenge, whose consequences would shape South Africa, Britain, and the Empire. Within 50 years of arriving in southern Africa, the British had seized land controlled by the Dutch and established two new colonies, Cape Colony on the southern tip and the colony of Natal, which the British annexed in 1843. This is its capital, Pietermaritzburg, in KwaZulu-Natal, and here the footprint of empire is plain to see. The great survivor. I had not expected to find the Queen Empress Victoria still here, her statue untoppled, ungraffitied, but also I notice uncleaned. The grand civic buildings reminiscent of Manchester or Glasgow, and even the common postbox, stand as reminders of how the British constructed a familiar world in an alien terrain. But why would British men and women want to travel across the world to southern Africa? Dr. Trevor Ngwane is from the University of Johannesburg.
This is an 19th century map, and it's titled The Colonizability of Africa. What is really amazing is here, where they're talking about which parts of Africa are easier to colonize and what should the colonizer look out for.
What factors are important in the ease of colonization?
They were worried about health conditions, tropical disease like malaria. So they say, you know, if you go there, you're going at your own peril. But also the friendliness or not of the natives. So they would say things like, don't go there, they are warlike.
All of this territory was considered to be freely available to European powers.
Yeah, I think they just thought it was their, I don't know, divine right to take over Africa.
On paper, southern Africa might have looked unusually hospitable to the colonists, but its land was already home to a large indigenous population. How the white settlers proceeded to overpower the black population, seizing land and power, is central to South Africa's imperial history. The garrison at Fort Napier, established by the British when they seized Natal, overlooks Pietermaritzburg. Troops were stationed here during some of the most notorious wars in African history.
The song is about the spear, yeah.
That sort of song would have been sung in battle?
Not necessarily in battle, but it would be sung as the soldiers are drilling.
Umbozo Khoza's ancestor led 20,000 Zulu warriors against imperial troops at Isandlwana. As the British cut a swathe across southern Africa, the indigenous population fought to protect its lands. The wars fought by the Zulu kingdom have become celebrated legend. The Zulus have passed into British history as being very brave and very fierce.
Yes.
But would you say also that they were peace-loving?
I would really say we were peaceful until we got provoked. The challenge was the mission. The mission was to colonize. I think the leaders, they thought they were gonna just like having a walk on the park because they had guns. Only to find that these guys were really prepared to die for their land. The thing that they were fighting for was the future of their heritage and their culture.
The political and military strength of the Zulu people blocked the expansion of Britain's colonies in southern Africa. In 1879, imperial forces massed on its border, primed to invade. But within days, a British force sent into Zulu territory was overwhelmed at Isandlwana as 20,000 Zulu warriors countered the threat.
You can imagine 20,000 regiments singing in unison. But they all step on one pulse. It's like they could count, like bars, 1, 2, 3, 4, and like intimidating the regiments from Britain. And as they were getting closer and starting to shoot, they were already finished.
So Zulus with weapons like these?
Yes.
The British with these. Tell me about this weapon.
This one is Martin Henry. It was able to kill at least 5 people per bullet.
Tell me then, how are the Zulus able to fight with this against this?
I think it was a matter of understanding first the methods of the British Army, because these were taking 1 bullet. So you can imagine the commander says, fire! And then, boo, 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 and then they say, cease fire. And then they're taking like different positions in the other row. As they're busy doing that, the Zulus would be faster finishing them.
The Zulus were ready to die for their land. But indigenous Africans could not prevail. And there would be a new wave of settlers who uncovered the extraordinary wealth of Africa deep in its soil.
I have found gold.
Early British settlers saw southern Africa as a vast and alien land that needed their civilizing influence.
After Natal became a colony, the British established a governor in this fine house. He was, of course, responsible to the Queen's ministers in London. But at a time when messages could take months to arrive, urgent matters were often settled locally.
The governor's first task was to seed the colony with British settlers who would manage the land and its population. Among those who seized the opportunity were ancestors of Robert King.
When did your family arrive in South Africa?
On the 10th of October, 1849.
And who was that?
That was my great-great-grandparents, John and Janet King, and Janet's spinster sisters, and a bachelor brother, James Ellis.
Any idea how arduous their journey was?
It was a terrible journey out. It lasted 3 months, and they came out in an old whaler that leaked the whole way.
For many people in Britain, facing high levels of unemployment and poverty at home, migration to the colonies offered a new life and the chance to prosper.
What was the attraction of Africa, do you think?
Well, it was the Byrne immigration scheme and the fact that things in Europe were not good with the revolutions and potato blight.
And he had the chance here of a chunk of land.
Yes, and improving and making himself independent.
Robert's family came to Natal with the help of a scheme set up in 1849 by Joseph Byrne, a speculator who promised passage to this new world and cheap land. But they were to discover that his promises were overblown.
To quote from James King's memoirs, "We were dumped on the veldt one afternoon in May 1850. The weather was fine but cold, and the only covering overhead was a large waterproof tarpaulin set up on poles. The farm was quite unimproved, and it was the edge of civilization as far as Natal was concerned." Joseph Byrne thought he'd make a successful profit out of it. Of course, it turned out to be a failure.
What was your family's view of Joseph Byrne and his scheme?
Oh, they certainly thought he was a swindler. They were allocated 20 acres, which was insufficient for farming here in southern Africa. And it's also an issue when you think that this wasn't empty land that was taken over. It was, in many senses, stolen from the indigenous people.
How was it during the 19th century that a small white minority was able to govern a large black majority?
They had guns. The way they eventually controlled them politically was another matter altogether. Natal, as a British colony, recognised that everyone had the right to the vote. However, you had to have a certain amount of income and the other thing to be able to read and write English. In Natal, it meant that very few Africans got the vote.
Britain, in its home policy, didn't have to deal with the colour of skins. So the rights of the races, how and where they lived, were decided here.
As the number of migrants increased and the colony expanded, the white minority devised rules to control and subdue the black majority. They were corralled in native reserves and employed in jobs that no white man wanted.
There are some 200 so-called mountains like this, made not of gold dust, but dust from gold mines. They represent 150 years of spoil, still scarring the landscape today.
Millions of tons of dirt were ripped from the earth during the sinking of vast mines like this.
Well, it was a bright day at the surface, but we descend into the damp, murky depths and going down just about 75 meters. Some guys had to go down 3,000 meters to find their gold.
With its diamonds and gold, Southern Africa was a place where fortunes could be made by those willing to risk everything.
Now, the business part of the mine. Every day, each shaft at this mine received 3,000 men going down on the morning shift. There were 15 shafts, 45,000 men working this mine alone. And they came to conditions like this. The gold is always at an angle from north to south. They carve into it and they push that week by week, month by month in that direction. The face where they worked, no more than a meter high, so they were bent double or lying on their back to work, with the constant threat that the roof might tumble in, might crush a hand or a leg and put them out of work.
Hundreds and thousands of black workers toiling in gold mines enabled a handful of white men to become the richest people in Southern Africa and among the wealthiest in the empire. One was Cecil Rhodes, who at the age of 17 was sent to work on his brother's cotton farm in Natal. His ascent to wealth was spectacular, and he shaped not just Southern Africa, but the British Empire across the continent.
In 1887, a year after gold was discovered, Cecil Rhodes chose this site for the Rand Club. It was to exhibit all the elegance and exclusivity that a British gentleman would expect wherever he might find himself in the world. Rhodes had grown cotton in Natal, made a fortune in diamonds, and now he turned his attention to gold.
Here in Johannesburg, the most powerful and wealthy men did deals and redrew the map of British Africa. Brian McKenchie is chairman of the Rand Club's House Committee.
What a very splendid building it is.
Thank you very much.
Tell me about its design.
So the inspiration for the club was taken from the Reform Club in London, and the idea really being that it's a piece of London in the sort of dry, dusty, upstart Transvaal.
I hear this expression, the Rand Lords. What does it mean?
It's really the wealthy mining magnates at the founding of Johannesburg, and these people had incredible, lavish lifestyles.
So just how exclusive was the Rand Club in its early days?
It was terribly exclusive. To become a member, you had to be proposed and seconded. And once you had been proposed and seconded, your name would then go onto a list, and the list would be put up at the front of the clubhouse, and there were black balls next to your name. And if your name got, I think, 3 black balls, you weren't allowed to become a member.
What kind of qualifications do you think you needed? Was this about pedigree? Was it about money? Was it about ethics?
Joburg was an upstart town, so I think money was really the thing that spoke.
Almost overnight, Southern Africa's wealth was in the hands of an unlikely collection of men.
Let's start with Cecil Rhodes. We know about his wealth and power, but he started as a sickly young man from Bishop Stortford, who came out here for reasons of health. His main business partner was Charles Rudd, another rather sickly youth, although in his days at Cambridge, he was quite a useful sportsman. Perhaps the most surprising, a Jewish Cockney boy, Barney Banato. He had at one time made his living as a prize fighter and as a juggler, but he had real business acumen. Here's Solly Joel, son of a publican, but once described as the richest young man in Britain. He put his money into racehorses and bought the Drury Lane Theatre. And finally, John Dale Lace. He was born in the Isle of Man, said to be the most handsome member of the club and the best dressed. And what became of his wealth? Well, his wife took milk baths in a marble tub.
Gold had given the Rand Lords absolute power over the empire's southern African colonies.
By contrast with having wealth in the United Kingdom, for example, at that time in southern Africa, you not only had the money, but you had control of human beings.
It was quite shocking control. Rhodes was in the diamond diggings in Kimberley, and he was asked when he looked over the diggings, did he see money, did he see wealth? And his response was he saw power. And, you know, Rhodes really had this vision that he wanted to paint Africa in British red. So you would have this vast tract of red all the way from Cape to Cairo, and really expand the British Empire, which I think was something that was a very popular view at the turn of the century.
A few millionaires wielded extraordinary financial and political power, and most significantly, controlled a vast number of people. The black population that had stood in the way of colonial expansion was harnessed to work for the white bosses. But how could so few rule so many? Dr. Trevor Ngwane is a specialist in workers' rights.
I would say that no one wanted to come to the mines. There was brutality, there was violence, there was racism, but many men found that in order to survive, they had to supplement their livelihood with coming to the mines.
And what kind of wages might they expect here, do you think?
Very low wages. The mine owners pushed a very hard bargain.
Were there any opportunities for self-improvement amongst the miners?
Well, there was a rigid race caliber, so certain jobs were out of bounds for black workers. And even if the mine owners wanted to promote black workers, they had a problem because the white workers felt threatened by black workers. But in any case, keeping black workers without any career options cheapened their labor, so the mine owners preferred that.
Gold had secured Britain's imperial might over people and land. But imperial greed would cause appalling damage to British prestige. On the eve of the 20th century, Britain's hunger for gold triggered one of the bloodiest and most expensive conflicts in the history of the empire, embroiling British forces in a demoralizing guerrilla war.
I wouldn't call it murderous, but I would call it callous.
The empire's expansion across southern Africa was a highly profitable business. Gold and diamonds created enormous wealth, but in the end, there was a cost. Buildings like this, scattered across the South African landscape, are the legacy of a bloody war sparked by the empire's greed.
So, hands and knees the only way to get in. Immediately I'm struck by the thickness of the walls. They really are tremendous. These places must have been hugely expensive to build, and they took an average of 3 months. Normally these blockhouses had a machine gun emplacement. I don't see any sign of one here, but certainly lots of slits where riflemen could be positioned standing on ladders. And here I perceive the reason why the blockhouse was built in this position. It was to overlook the railway, tremendously important to the British to control these tracks.
As early British colonists had advanced across southern Africa, descendants of the original Dutch settlers, known as Boers, had retreated inland and settled two self-governing republics. They couldn't know that they had chosen some of the most valuable land in Africa. To understand how decades of hostility between the British and the Boers escalated into a bloody war in which more than 70,000 men, women, and children died, I'm talking to historian Roger Webster.
Paint me a picture of the Boer. The word means farmer.
Farmer, yes. The average farmer read one book, and that was the Bible. Okay, and he took that literally, and he believed that God had given him the land to live off, and that's how he lived. They didn't like the British one iota. They found them untrustworthy. And in some ways they were, because, you know, whether one likes it or not, if you look at history, They were the spin doctors of the world.
Thinking now about the South African War, why does the Boer leader Kruger declare war on the British?
Because he was fully aware of the fact that Britain wanted to invade. And the reason why he knew it is he watched what the British did in Zululand in 1879 at Isandlwana and Ulundi. They wanted the war, okay? Why? Because they wanted Zululand. And that's exactly how it was engineered. Now, they did exactly the same to Kruger. They amassed forces on his border, and Kruger says, if you do not withdraw your troops within 10 days, I'm going to declare war. And this is what he does. And Chamberlain stands up in Parliament in Britain and waves the telegram and says, gentlemen, we've done it. We've made them go to war. So that was all planned beforehand to get fingers on the gold.
In 1899, when the South African War, as it's now known, began, the British felt confident of swift victory. After all, the Boers were farmers, not military men, and were not expected to fight back effectively.
How do you think the Boer fighting against the British were able to hold out for so long?
Well, firstly, being a farmer, they were expert marksmen. Secondly, they were expert horsemen, and they knew the country, whereas the British didn't. They were aware of the terrain, but they didn't know all the nooks and crannies and where to duck and where to hide, because you'd get situations, particularly in a terrain like this, where they just disappear because they knew exactly where to go.
With the arrival of reinforcements, British commanders believed victory was in their sights. But their traditional military skills were of little use against the tactics deployed by the Boers. The British found themselves mired in a guerrilla war.
Are the South Africans fighting on because of gold?
Yes, the wealth of the country. You know, those are the richest gold mines that the world's ever seen.
As guerrilla attacks continued month after month, the British built more than 8,000 blockhouses, spread over 3,500 miles to fence in and eliminate the Boer commandos.
The British High Commissioner said, why don't we build lines of blockhouses to hem these Boers in and use the barbed wire? And what they would do is they would roll out the barbed wire and put cans and bells on them, so that if anybody interfered with it, they could hear it in the blockhouse.
You have to imagine this blockhouse and many others, connected by hundreds of miles of barbed wire, serving to enclose thousands of Boers so they couldn't get out and cause trouble for the British. And here are the cement footings of the posts that held the barbed wire, and here, surviving more than 100 years, original barbed wire.
Throughout the conflict, with every assault against them, the Boers' defiance grew, and they refused to surrender.
The response was to burn the farms and round up the population, men, women, and children, reviving an old military tactic of scorched earth and developing a modern one of the concentration camp.
For centuries, military strategists had scorched the earth to destroy crops, homes, and infrastructure which the enemy could use to survive. Under Lord Kitchener, the British set out to break Boer resistance. Nearly 30,000 homesteads were razed to the ground. The fields were torched and livestock slaughtered as troops cleared the land of Boer and black African civilians. The war then became one of the most shaming episodes in British history.
Here at Heidelberg, near Johannesburg, the British built concentration camps, mainly for women and children, a few men, and black Africans. 100 such camps appeared across the country. The scorched earth policy was brutal, but Britain's neglect of its prisoners was far more deadly.
In 1900, the British began to round up and transport Boer and black civilians to camps, where they would live in appalling conditions behind barbed wire. This cemetery records the tragedy that unfolded in the concentration camps. Historian Dr. Lindy Courts has studied how the empire applied this inhumane policy.
Camps were at first established for men who were called the so-called hensoppers, or the hands-uppers, people who had surrendered, and their families. But then as the scorched earth policy comes about, you have destitute families whose farms had been destroyed, and they then join these camps. And then as the countryside is swept, the numbers grow.
The numbers grow to what?
Close to 100,000 people in the end.
And in what sorts of condition?
Terrible. Here you have a Boer family in one of their tents. And what I find very striking is the mother. Look at her face.
Yes.
You see, very gaunt, very strained. But you also see the strain on the children. By the time they had reached the camps, they had witnessed things that one would not want a child to witness. Many of them had witnessed battles, because in the early phases of the war, many of the Boers actually took their wives and children with them on commando to protect them from the British. So these children witnessed the battles. They witnessed the violence of their homes being burnt. So that trauma stayed with many of them. The amount of babies who died from dehydration, from heat exhaustion, from being kept on open cattle trucks, open wagons, in the extreme heat, to arrive at these camps and there's nothing for them.
Is this then, in your view, a murderous policy or an incompetent policy?
I wouldn't call it murderous, but I would call it callous. Kitchener, it was well known, was no friend of women at all. So their pleas for their conditions and their children's conditions, that fell on deaf ears.
45 such camps were erected for Boer civilians, and a further 66 for black Africans. Polluted water, hunger, infectious diseases, and exposure to the elements all contributed to the horrifying death toll in the camps.
I imagine that the atrocities of empire were committed because the colonists had unfettered power over people that they regarded as inferior, because they were very far from the scrutiny of those who might hold them to account. Back home, a British sense of decency had been less corrupted by imperialism. If the British Empire had a conscience that could be pricked, it was to be found there.
A Cornish suffragette and pacifist, Emily Hobhouse, heard of these concentration camps. Concerned by the plight of the imprisoned families, she travelled to South Africa. She wrote, "Thousands physically unfit are kept in conditions of life that they have not the strength to endure." Since the outset of the war, Hobhouse had campaigned for a peaceful settlement. Now her mission turned to improving conditions for the thousands of Boer women and children in the British camps.
Emily Hobhouse exposed what was going on in South Africa to the British public. And her exposing it was actually an enormous embarrassment to the British government. But they had this investigated, and that led to measures being taken to improve the conditions in the camps. And from there on, the mortality rate actually began dropping.
The changes implemented because of Hobhouse saved white lives, though still nearly 28,000 Boers died during internment. More than 15,000 black Africans also died in the camps. What has been the legacy for the Afrikaner people of all of this?
In terms of our political legacy, this, like nothing else, was an impetus to Afrikaner nationalism and one of the most horrific policies of discrimination in the 20th century.
To what extent were those horrendous policies we're referring to apartheid based on a legacy from the British Empire?
It was a continuation of a colonial order. I would take it as far back as the Dutch, actually. But then the British come along and they add further segregationist measures to that. So it's a policy on which everyone was, they were all building on this. They were all contributing to this.
The war was ruinously expensive for the British, but the bigger cost was to the reputation of the British Empire. It struggled over years to beat small, irregular forces, and the tactics used to win horrified public opinion at home and abroad. The South Africans, having been so badly treated, won a sort of moral victory alongside their military defeat. And when it came to sitting down to devise the Union of South Africa a few years later, they, and not the British, held the high ground. For decades, British rule in southern Africa had relied on white domination. But as the new century dawned, racial division would undermine the empire's legitimacy in bitter struggles that have left their mark on South Africa today. Late one night in June 1893, an Indian lawyer, newly arrived in Natal, was travelling by train from Durban on behalf of a client. Shortly before the train pulled into Pietermaritzburg, his ticket was checked. Even as the holder of a first-class ticket, with his brown face, he was ordered to move to third class. When he refused, this British subject, a London-trained barrister, was thrown off. His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, one day to become Mahatma Gandhi.
Stung with indignation, having been hurled from the train, Gandhi came to the telegraph office and sent cables to his friends and to the railway company. They were probably the first words of many millions that he would write during 21 years in South Africa.
The abolition of slavery in the 1830s triggered a labour shortage across Europe's colonies. But within the British Empire, armies of workers could be moved from one colony to another. Thousands of Indians flocked to Natal to work as indentured labourers on its sugar plantations. This migration, which Gandhi witnessed, would create further racial complexity and tension in southern Africa, and a political challenge to the empire which crossed continents. David Gengen is from the Gandhi Memorial Committee.
When Gandhi has been thrown off the train, what's going through his mind?
He felt that everybody who's a British citizen should enjoy the same rights wherever they were in the world, and he found when he came to South Africa that that was not happening. Legislation was then being passed to restrict the movement of Indians. In fact, there were certain territories in South Africa where Indian people couldn't even reside.
This is interesting. Already there are restrictions on Indians as to where they live and how they can work, decades and decades before apartheid.
British control of southern Africa relied on white power over black. The newly arrived Indian population was slotted into a racial hierarchy between the whites and blacks as second-class citizens. Even a highly educated British subject like Gandhi would be judged by his colour rather than his qualifications.
What did Gandhi decide to do?
He began to organize people. In 1894, he established the first formal political formation in South Africa, which was the Natal Indian Congress, which was a precursor to the African National Congress, the ruling party today. So people then had a forum in which to protest some of the actions that actually happened.
This is interesting because he's a British subject, he's a middle-class figure, he's well off, and he's working on behalf of Indians, people of Indian heritage living in South Africa. Does he care much about the black people?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because he came obviously to fight a particular case, right? The cause was mainly around the Indian issues, but in his later writings, I mean, he made this point that because South Africa was part of the British colony, that the indigenous African population had the same rights as British citizens.
Today, racism is almost universally condemned. But at the end of the 19th century, in many societies, racial hierarchies were taken for granted. It wasn't just Europeans who had this idea that they were ethnically superior. The moral standards of today are completely different from those of history.
Gandhi believed that the British Empire had betrayed its colonial subjects by making them unequal. His act of defiance didn't sweep away the divisions that had become entrenched under colonial rule, but it did help to lay the foundations for a revolutionary movement. In 1948, the all-white government formalized decades of social and political segregation in the laws of apartheid. It would not be dismantled until Nelson Mandela and the ANC led the majority population to replace white rule. Was apartheid the inevitable result of the British presence in southern Africa? Professor Nyasha Umboti from the University of Johannesburg has a very clear view that they are linked.
The apartheid originates in the British Empire. The idea of subordinating black people and making them into a vassal class does not start after 1948. The Zulus, who have been defeated, who have been dispossessed, they say, let's put them into reserves. Let's put them into locations where they can become a reservoir of labor for white farms, for white mining areas and so on. And so they're supposed to live in those reserves.
Was there a moment where there could have been a liberal democracy established? Was the moment 1910? Was the moment missed then?
Could we have a liberal democracy in 1910? Absolutely not, because black people were in the majority, easily outnumbering white people. So in a democracy, if you are going to give all of them the vote, then they were going to be in power. So how could you then make those people part of a constitutional or liberal democracy? That would have been very inconvenient to the system that was being set up.
If this is the funeral of the British Empire and you're asked to write the epitaph, what do you say?
I'll say good riddance, but the scars are still with us. They are in our minds, they are in our hearts, they are in our psyche. South Africa right now is the most unequal society in the world. 1 in 2 South Africans are living in poverty right now. There's 30 million out of a population of 60 million. And generations will still have to deal with this monster that is empire.
The Apartheid Museum records decades of legally enshrined racism and segregation. Apartheid did not happen overnight. It built on, consolidated, and perfected practices established under British colonial rule, indeed from the moment that settlers first arrived. That is a distressing and humbling thought if you're British, indeed if you're white. The people I've met here have shown me that the country's history is being reconsidered to include African perspectives excluded until now. I found myself learning a lot about South Africa's past, and indeed painfully about that of my own country.
In the next programme, how the dream of a new England was swept away by the greatest rebellion in British history.
We wanted to be as British as you guys.
How dangerous was this activity for the spies?
You paid with your life.
And how a new vision of empire rose from the ashes.
This country was built on the backs of these children.